This is What's at Stake, a Penta podcast.
Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Elliott Owensby. I'm Managing Director at Penta in the San Francisco office. Here today with my colleagues Andy Whitehouse, a Senior Partner in New York, and Jill Craig, a Partner in Brussels. Thank you both for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Elliott.
Thanks for having me, Elliott.
As you both know, mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, have long been a path for growth and expansion for businesses and organizations of all types. And ideally, they generate some shareholder value as well, although we'll get into that. And completing the transaction itself is complex enough, especially today with the macro environment and a lot of those complexities. But even more specifically, now there's a whole new set of issues around managing some of the stakeholder expectations that get baked into all sides of the deal from all sides of all types of constituencies. So as the two of you are some of our best experts in the public affairs and regulatory work and communications work that go into a successful M&A strategy from the pre announcement all the way through the regulatory war zone where a lot of these places end up. That's my word. I don't know how y'all would characterize that. I wanted to get into some of the kind of trends and topics around the issue broadly, such that we can kind of start with M&A, get into some of the regulatory action, and then maybe sort of a look ahead on all fronts.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elliott. That was a super helpful setup, and it's really exciting to be here to talk about this really important topic. So I guess maybe we can start just taking a look at 2022 and the sort of the deal picture then. And interestingly, at least from my perspective, overall deal volumes for 2022, if we think about it in terms of total value, more or less matched levels before the pandemic. Obviously, we'd seen a big tick up during the pandemic itself in M&A and activity. But 2022 overall sort of matched where we were before the pandemic arrived. And if we think about how the sort of the market looks right now in terms of at least the capital that's available, it's pretty clear to us here at Penta there's a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines now, both capital in the public markets and sitting in the private markets looking for the right kinds of opportunities. All of that being said, the last period here has been pretty bumpy from an M&A perspective. So sort of as the old Great Eastern analyst joke goes, it's more murders and executions than mergers and acquisitions. So what sort of things have we been seeing in the market for murders and executions? Much higher cost of capital, pretty significant disruption in the private markets over recent months, particularly thinking here about the mini banking crisis that we've seen in the US. The conclusion of the SPAC boom that was a really big driver of M&A activity over recent years, the special purpose acquisition companies. And then obviously continuing tensions, and in some parts of the world, much worse than tensions between countries. And all of those trends, I think, play a pretty important role in shaping the way that the strategy teams, the C-suite leadership teams in companies think about their approach to inorganic growth. I'm very excited, though, later in the conversation, talk about what this might mean. You teed it up really nicely, Elliott, and thinking about how stakeholders are shaping all of this, and some of the things that leaders can do to ensure that their M&A strategy is successful.
Yeah. There's no doubt that, if I will say, sitting here in San Francisco, sitting near Silicon Valley, the Twitter meme of the zero interest rate phenomenon is particularly acute. And I think that, there's no separating, I think, any of those factors you laid out from one another, Andy, but I think starting with the cost of capital and really the end of a protracted, it's not a groundbreaking insight to say that, for 15 years with the cost of capital at zero, that generated some very specific business models. It generated some very specific capital structures for some of these deals and some of these transactions. And I think the broader, coping or the broader reckoning of that, we've seen some, of course, but I think that some of this almost at a kind of strategic finance level is probably still being borne out. And certainly it's not that there are no deals, right? But it's a different type of deal probably. And it's a different set of conditions under which those are completed. And I'm very curious. I know we all have a keen eye on how that looks both on the kind of near-term horizon, but also in that middle term where you may see some of those macro conditions, shifting or softening a little bit, maybe more favorably. The other part of M&A, of course, and any transaction, especially of a certain size, is the regulatory aspect of it. And I'll say that, of course, in the U.S., this is work we've done extensively, whether it's in front of, all the way from state attorneys general through federal regulators and federal courts. And there's no doubt that, especially under Chair Khan, the FTC in particular has taken a very aggressive stance towards regulating M&A, in their view, potentially regulating competition, and they seem to have a version going, and logically, I suppose you could see it, of the Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott quote that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and that by sheerly challenging some of these transactions overall, they will be able to kick up some opposition one way or the other, or potentially have a broader dissuading impact on firms that are considering this type of transaction. I personally think that's probably maybe the longer game, is setting up a stricter environment such that it on the margin tilts firms away from this type of activity. But that's my own take. Jill, I'm wondering if you could read us in a little bit on how the regulatory environment stands in the EU and how that may be affecting kind of some of the activity over there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the main tool in the EU toolbox is really the merger regulation, and the authority responsible for enforcing that regime is the European Commission, which has a specialized competition directorate that's responsible for all of that. And as you said, when a potential deal comes in above a certain threshold for turnover, then that's the Commission's job then to assess whether or not that transaction would significantly impact on competition in the European single market. So what they do is they carry out an initial review of the deal, and if they believe that transaction could significantly affect competition, then they open a more in-depth investigation. And at that stage, the Commission has the authority then either to ask for some concessions from either of the parties involved, or even to block the merger if it finds that competition is overly impeded. But I would say that despite the fact that's all laid down in regulation, and antitrust is the primary focus of all of that, in recent times, the Commission has become perhaps a little bit more political in its decisions about how it considers other factors. And in those other factors, I'm thinking like, for example, the impact on jobs in Europe, the competitiveness of European industry would be another one, where Europe might feel threatened if it became over-reliant on supplies from other non-European countries and so on. So I think depending on who's in charge in the Commission Competition Authority, the EU approach to it can become more or less political.
I'd like to stay with that for a second, because I don't know that I had heard that or thought of it in that way. The impact on European competitiveness overall, or kind of industrial competitiveness. How have you sort of seen that take shape? I mean, we don't need to get into specifics unless you'd like to, but I'm curious, because I think that's frankly, it's an evolving thing. I think you see in the U.S. with some of the semiconductor work, for example, is the growing recognition that turns out maybe ultimately we do want some of these big firms, and in particular, we want them in the United States with ideally, very American supply chains, so to speak, right? How has that played out within the context of kind of, competition or antitrust in the EU?
Well, in back in the day, that used to be anathema, of course, and especially this kind of state aid idea was very much frowned upon. But increasingly, as we see perhaps a step away from more globalized trade or supply chains, we see that indeed some of those transactions come under pressure from from member countries of the EU that say actually they want to support certain strategic industries or have to have a European champion for a certain sector. I mean, we've seen that with the CHIPS Act, as you mentioned. There's so many things like that, areas like that, where the European Union doesn't want to feel that it's been left behind by other regimes or other jurisdictions that have a more perhaps accepting environment or friendly environment for businesses who want to locate there.
Yeah, but that's a fascinating point. Both the use of that criteria as in developing champions, but also in sort of defining opponents and making sure that actually this is going to violate a piece of what we want to bring forward for this economy or for this industry. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and as well, I mean, given the context, I mean, both of you set out at the beginning, where things are heading from a kind of economic point of view, and in Europe, since the end of the post-COVID period, transactions came to a sort of quite an abrupt halt in the middle of last year with the invasion of Ukraine. Since then, we've seen, higher energy prices, inflation, higher interest rates, and, a more general fear of recession. So, I think some of those conditions are still with us today in Europe, but there is some more geopolitical and economic uncertainty. Even if inflation is going in the right direction, supply chains are becoming a bit more stable as well. And so, that could be a sign that things are looking up, and that actually there may be, especially given that, the UK pound, the British pound, the euro are still looking quite weak against the US dollar. In no doubt, European assets look quite cheap at the moment for US buyers. And while that's good for M&A, the competition authority or the political elite in the EU may well be looking to that to say, okay, what might that mean actually for some of those European industry champions that might be affected by that? So it has a sort of double-edged side to it.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, and we'll get into this a little bit. It's slightly beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today, but your point on FX, I think, is a good reminder that funds that have raised in dollars are looking increasingly, globally to deploy those dollars, just given the marginal purchasing power they have in some of those cases. But that's a great point. I wanted to sort of along those lines. I wanted to check with both of you on your perspective on, how relevant is the size of the deal, right? So the FTC in particular has certainly started challenging smaller transactions, which is I don't know that any of us would say that there's inherently a dollar value where a transaction deserves scrutiny or not. Although I should say that in the U.S. there are rules like Hart-Scott-Rodino where above a certain threshold, you're going to get some kind of regulatory review. It doesn't imply necessarily the sort of the full gauntlet that the FTC or the DOJ will provide. But under that threshold, roughly, I think it's about $500 million. You're not going to get the same scrutiny, and that's been a real point of contention over the years. And there's probably some merit to, does it matter if you get to $1 billion with $100 million acquisitions or with two larger? There's probably some merit to sussing out the smaller deal. So, and Andy, I'll start with you kind of on this mid-market point. What's your take on the presence of the mid-market overall in the US and sort of what, do those smaller deals sort of have a different set of challenges compared to the larger or not? And then Jill, I'd love your take as well, within the kind of regulatory context of the EU.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Elliott, and I think the sort of the bumpy context, the turbulence that Jill and I have been talking about, I think one effect of that is to increase stakeholder scrutiny of proposed deals considerably, to put much more attention on deals that are being announced, almost irrespective of size. So if I was talking to to a company or to a private equity firm that was considering a significant mid-market type transaction in the US, I don't know that I would necessarily, perhaps other than the political context, I'm not sure that I would be sort of downplaying the need for them to focus on how is it that customers are going to react to this? How is it that the investor landscape more broadly is going to take this in? What are your employees going to say? What are the employees on the other side of the transaction going to say? I suppose it could be the case that that for political actors, the smaller deals are less important, but the transparency that the contemporary digital environment offers, I think, means that there is a real possibility that even relatively small deals can suddenly find themselves on the front page of newspapers or in the sort of on the agenda of policymakers. And so, and maybe we'll talk about this in a bit, just some of the advice that we would give on how to prepare for a deal announcement and the period between a deal being announced and closing. I think there's, in some ways, actually, the scale of the deal really doesn't matter anymore. You need to still go through that same strategic process from a communications perspective, to do everything you can to get the deal to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I do want to come back to that here shortly. Jill, how would you say the size of the transaction affects scrutiny or not in the EU?
I mean, there is a fixed kind of threshold that applies at EU level, but I think the scrutiny is still there. Also, these companies that we're talking about are likely headquartered or present in particular countries where there's more political pressure. So while we're talking about the EU as a collective, a lot of this is being discussed at national level in the EU member countries. So those countries also have their own national competition authorities and merger controls that deal with things at a national level as well. Sometimes below the EU threshold, so that only the biggest deals really go at EU level. So undoubtedly, if you're talking about a national champion or even a large employer, for example, in any particular country, then inevitably it will come under much more public scrutiny. As Andy said, from the whole range of stakeholders who will be involved, whether that's the competition authorities or politicians who represent those regions where those companies are set up, or whether it's the employees of those companies, or indeed prospective other purchasers who might be interested in that market. So I think there's plenty to think about in that regard as well.
Yeah, and I should say we're focused here on the U.S. and the EU, generally speaking, but no doubt that even within those constituencies and beyond them, there are plenty of other points of scrutiny. I know, of course, the UK now has the CMA is on its own, but I think that there's plenty of other points across the world where you see a lot of these sort of points of friction with some of these transactions. All right, so let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk about some best practices and how companies can navigate this both today and going forward.
On the first Friday of every month, Penta analyzes the latest jobs and labor market data in a digestible format. Sign up for our reports at pentagroup.co or on Twitter at PentaGRP.
Welcome back to What's at Stake. Andy, Jill, let's dive back in where we left off on sort of the stakeholder framework and the stakeholder concept overall as it applies to some of these transactions and managing, as I sort of said at the top, like I don't know the better way to say it except for the expectations of these stakeholders, and they are numerous and varied with their each divergent interests. Managing those expectations across the full life cycle of a transaction. Andy, I wonder if you might start us off with sort of how you think about that as you're counseling clients from getting a call from a lawyer all the way through final approval.
Yeah, no, that's I think it's really important, and I think the one of the things that's been really gratifying to see, both as formerly in in-house communications professional and now as an advisor is the degree to which I think companies are really taking communication seriously, sort of across the life cycle of M&A, as you were framing it, Elliott. So even from before the announcement of a prospective deal through to the closing. And then I think critically, beyond the closing. So these are sort of, I guess, what we would describe at Penta as multiple moments of truth, and the culmination of lots and lots of work by lots of different people on the deal team and beyond. I think one thing that's just obvious, perhaps, but really hard for companies to do is to stay in the momentum of work after the deal closes, when actually all of that exciting post-merger stuff needs to happen, and which has a huge communications piece at the center of it. But just a few things I would be thinking about. So I think the most successful deal makers, as I say, are now really focused on the power of communications and marketing in the context of their deal-making activity. And I'd point to maybe 4 or 5 things that I would say to our clients that I think are really important. The first of those is that in the run-up to the announcement of any transaction of significance, there is a real opportunity for the deal teams on both sides to think about the risks associated with the deal, to weigh up the places where stakeholders might have questions, where the argument you're making for the rationale for the transaction might get tested. And the opportunity is there to do the scenario planning around the things that come through as the most hazardous risks and the most likely risks for the deal that you're proposing. And using that time before you go public, obviously with real care and sensitivity around the protection of information, to prepare everybody for the possibility of things that might go wrong, is something that we would certainly see as very best practice, and has been an interesting element of some of the deals we've worked on. Maybe this is obvious, but we see it in many places that it's almost impossible to communicate to, both following the announcement, particularly with employees and customers, but also right the way up to the deal closing. There are constraints in that period between announcement and deal closing, but people are hungry for information, and my bias would always be towards trying to say as much as you're able to within the constraints that exist. It is, as I say, really easy to sort of get down into the weeds of making the transaction successful, and lose sight of the need to keep stakeholders on side along the way. And I know, Jill, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on sort of how reputation building across the board, but particularly in that period, might play into how it is that regulators and political actors think about this. But then maybe one just quick last one, and then we can talk a bit about what happens after the deal. Obviously, it's really important between announcement and close to keep a close eye on competitors and other capital market players who might see this sort of moment of truth as an opportunity to cause disruption. And so we'll always counsel clients on the importance of keeping a closer eye than ever on what competitors are doing that might seek to be disruptive, and to just think about some of the other players in the capital markets, including activists who may seek to engage in the transaction in a way that could make it harder to execute.
Yeah, I think, and I especially love the first point, Andy, which is, I think we see this secular trend towards a greater emphasis on communications and understanding, internally, externally, the emphasis there. But really, our approach at Penta, and the most successful approach in our view, is like, you don't have to let the comms guys into the data room, but you have to let them sit next door. And it is working so hand in glove with strategic finance, with legal, with government affairs, that is the recipe for success. And I think there's an understandable sensitivity, as you say. These are incredibly sensitive business matters, incredibly, big market moving events in most cases. But the way to victory is not to have, your comm strategy parachute in at the end. It's to make sure that it is integrated throughout. And in that diligence process, and I mean, we've all worked on this type of project as well, which is frankly the most fascinating part in some ways of the transaction, is, we get asked constantly, can you give me your external affairs diligence on this, your communications diligence on this? Because to your point, Andy, you turn up risks that, there are market and financial risks, of course, but there are broader reputational and image risks that are fascinating. And I can think of examples where we've worked through these exercises, and ultimately someone backed away from a transaction because they said, "Oh, actually, you're right. I hadn't thought about it like that. That would pose a real issue for one of my stakeholders. Would be it, not generally investors, but usually employees or customers or whatever else may be. Oh, wow, I totally see where that would intersect." Jill, I wonder on that front, thinking about the, working closely and coordinating with regulatory affairs, government affairs, some of the kind of the benefits of your reputation building. I think, Andy, I'm stealing your phrase, but friends before you need them, right? And how that sort of plays into the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this, as Andy set out, there's so many different stakeholder groups that are involved in or are impacted by these deals. That if you're thinking about government officials, elected representatives that may have a close relationship or connection with the companies involved, local communities, NGOs, even industry bodies, all of these are hungry for information. And as we all know in the communications business, if you leave a gap, someone else will fill it, or people will make up the rest themselves. So, we need to make sure that we would counsel clients on this, that they have a very targeted engagement plan with all of those stakeholders that is consistent, that is, that has a core message. It might be small steps. It might just be a reassurance to those stakeholders that you are keeping them informed, and that you know that they are important stakeholders in this process, even if, that, as you say, Andy, it can be very sensitive about what kind of information can be released. I think the whole idea of stakeholder engagement is that you build trusted relationships over time, and by providing regular updates and information, you help to not only build that relationship, but to be seen to be building that as well, and making the effort to actually have that relationship with people who you may well need for other things later on. And I mean, likely that there are teams within those companies involved in the deal who have multiple relationships themselves, and it's important that we counsel the clients to see their stakeholder environment very much as connected, and not to have a different strategy for government relations from the media, for example, or a different strategy for investor relations from government relations, because in the end, this all turns out to be one stakeholder community.
Right. I love the way you describe that cadence too, Jill, because it's so that I think you said that your commitment to keeping them informed, you can think about that across, the full spectrum of stakeholder groups, right? Across supply chain, or across customers, or across, certainly in some cases, media or government. It's I think when it's done well, right? And when I think where we're working on at Penta, like when that's applied well, it's remarkable, I think, how successful it can be.
Yeah.
Andy, you mentioned activists, and I do want to get back to that because I think that's an X factor that I do want to touch on briefly. I saw a research note from our friends at Goldman Sachs that said 1 in 4, 25% of the companies on the S&P 500 have an activist investor. We all know they come in many different flavors. There are plenty of, I would say, constructive activists that have a very specific goal. They say, great, here's what I think, you did it, okay, I have my exit opportunity. And then there's obviously more hostile approaches. Andy, I'm curious, in your experience and with your perspective, how does that dynamic change sort of the stakeholder strategy? At minimum, I guess I'll steal your point and say it adds a stakeholder that you may not always have to consider. But I'm curious how you see that sort of shifting.
Those are some amazing numbers, Elliott, and I think you're absolutely right that the entire dynamic of how we sort of think about the M&A market is inevitably going to get shifted by active holders of capital wanting to intervene in the way that companies are run and potentially reshape the way that they think about their portfolio of businesses or their portfolio of companies. I think, again, it's in the end, the takeaway for me here is the most sophisticated approach that we can take to worrying about our big stakeholder groups, the sort of the message that we preach here at Penta, whether it's customers, employees, political actors, or in this case, investors, the returns on taking a very thoughtful, hard-tested approach to the way that we think about stakeholder engagement just grows greater in a context where more capital is being used in an activist manner. I think the other thing that I would say that perhaps is a slightly indirect, but I think important answer to your question is that as long as M&A is an important part of corporate strategy and we look to inorganic opportunities alongside what it is we do organically to grow our companies, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that 80%, according to, I think, McKinsey numbers, 80% of deals ultimately prove to be unsuccessful. And I would wager a large part, or certainly some part of that, those set of deals that fail after they are closed, comes down to ineffective internal communications, not doing a good enough job with combining cultures, getting to the end of a long process of securing a deal to close, and then having the real hard graft of post-merger management, post-merger integration to do next. And not getting those things done well must be, for me, a significant driver of why it is that so many deals are unsuccessful. So even though you're exhausted at the end of this long process, you've sort of got to redouble the communications team and the leadership and put a huge focus on how it is we're going to bring teams together, how we're going to support colleagues to be effective in selling to a whole bunch of new customers they didn't have before, with new products and services that weren't part of the company before the deal was done. What it is we're going to do to integrate the newly acquired business with the things that exist. So perhaps a sort of underappreciated strategy for making your investors happy is working really hard on communications after the deal is done.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and no shortage of stakeholder and communications challenges post-close. Even some of those are probably, a lot of them I think end up internal and employee-facing, and in some cases I do think executives sort of wish they had the old set of problems instead of the new set of problems because it gets complicated, no doubt. I wanted to sort of close with each of you and ask you, and I didn't prep you for this, and I apologize, but ask each of you sort of if you had to summarize your stance in your respective jurisdictions, Andy will say in the U.S. and Jill in the EU. If you had to summarize sort of your hypothesis for the next couple of years in M&A, in antitrust, in regulation, how would you give that sort of bottom line takeaway for what companies or stakeholders should consider kind of within those jurisdictions? Andy, I'll start with you, and then we'll give Jill the last word.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to end, and I think I'd sort of turn back to where I began the argument, which is to say that we have been through a sort of a wonderful Goldilocks period of deal making. Things have got pretty turbulent in the last short while here, and one product of that turbulence that I think is actually strategically helpful is that the leaders of companies, I think, should put even more emphasis on stakeholder engagement in the context of deal making because of its outsized impact on whether deals are going to be successful or not. So, in a context where capital is worth more and more expensive, We want to make sure that we're doing the right deals, and having a deal that we're excited about and selling it effectively to all of our stakeholders just gets that much more important. So I think for communicators, for marketers, for other professionals for our investor relations colleagues who are spending their time helping the world understand why it is that a particular transaction is going to be important, the next few years, that role just gets, for me, put an even greater sort of point of emphasis on that work. And that's exciting. And obviously, our team at Penta are thrilled to have the opportunity to help businesses wherever we can.
Absolutely. Jill, what's your closing word from Brussels?
Yeah, from the regulatory point of view, I think it as I mentioned before, it is becoming potentially more political in Europe, but potentially elsewhere as well. And we are due to get a new European Commission next year. We don't yet know who is going to head up the competition authority and whether they will have a different take from the current competition commissioner. But I think it's important anyway in all deals, whether they're whatever size they are, that the parties really understand the regulatory landscape that they're involved in and the policy implications that are relevant to any M&A transaction. And as we've seen, that policy landscape evolves and can sometimes evolve very fast. So it's important to remember that while your deal is taking a huge focus of your time, that there are other things going on outside that you need to be fully aware of, and how those impact other stakeholders who are involved in your deal and making your deal a success. So keep your eyes wide open, I would say.
That is evergreen closing advice, Jill. I think that's perfect. Thank you both for joining me. To our listeners, remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter at PentaGRP. I'm your host, Elliott Owensby, and as always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake, Penta Podcast.
Thank you for listening to What's at Stake, a podcast produced by Penta. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at PentaGRP and follow us on the web at penta.co.